Welcome to today's webinar, Why Water Professionals Should Care About the Sustainable Development Goals, presented by Tony Slatyer. We're so glad you could join us today, and there's so many you have. Thank you very much. My name's Trevor Pillar. I'm the National Partnerships Manager here at IceWarm. Now, look, 29 countries, hundreds of people. Thank you for joining us. That's fantastic. There's lots of free webinars coming up in the next couple of months. You can see there. I won't go through each one. And there's some online courses and face-to-face courses also there. We'll go into those later on. But for today, the webinar's format is going to be a presentation and discussion with some Q&A, and we'll only go for 1 hour, so you can know for sure that we won't be going beyond 1 hour. Right, we are going to hand right over to Tony Slatyer. I'll introduce Tony. He's a consultant on water policy and governance. He has been the head of water division in the Australian Government's Department of Agriculture and Water Resources. There you are now, Tony. I see you. He retired in 2017. Mr. Slatyer was engaged by Australian Water Partnership as a special advisor on water to the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. And in this role, Tony assisted DFAT to support the Prime Minister's involvement in the UN High-Level Panel on Water, set up to exert political advocacy in the implementation of water-related SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals. The panel completed its work and reported to the UN in 2018. So this, I think, Tony, is right hot off the press, and we're so glad you could join us from
Canberra,
the beautiful Canberra in spring. Great place to be.
Yes, it's a lovely day here in early spring.
Wonderful. We're going to be in your hands, Tony. Thanks so much for taking the time on this and putting in the effort. We really appreciate your experience and outstanding years of work in this whole area of sustainable development goals. So it's right over to you.
Okay, well, let's get started.
Yep, PowerPoint's up. Good.
The PowerPoint is up. You should be able to see what I can see, and I'll endeavour to drive it efficiently from here.
Sounds good.
So we're going to talk about the Sustainable Development Goals. I note from the survey that many of you are already working with these goals, which is great news, and reflects a considerable change over the past year when a year ago, there really was very little awareness of the importance of these. So let's move on and talk about that. This webinar will cover 4 issues. First, I'll just explain a little about why we have the Sustainable Development Goals and what they are and what they do. Second, we'll talk about what they require of us, what has to be done to achieve them. Third, we'll talk about why you should care about these goals and why we need to work now to address their demands. And fourthly, just what can you do to help in this great global endeavour. So that's what we'll cover, and I think the way we'll structure this is that as we sort of reach each of these 4 points, we might have a little pause and take particular questions. But I'm going to also download a fair bit of information in these slides that are coming up, but you can take them, you'll be able to access the slides separately. I'm not going to read the information in them. As much as anything, they're there as a reference material for you, as well as helping structure this, this discussion. So the first thing to ask is why does this matter? And I think everybody in this room probably has a good feeling for that, but we have a major problem in the world, and the problem is that very large numbers of people do not have access to safe drinking water, and millions die every year from waterborne diseases that could be materially, that effect could be materially mitigated if water was better controlled and managed. So these are fundamental issues in economic development in many countries. It's very hard to develop the society if significant proportions of people cannot access low-cost, safe drinking water, and whilst the sanitation issues are so difficult. The risks of this are global in scale. They are a source of insecurity, of tension, of both within and between countries. The World Economic Forum has rated water security amongst its top 5 global risks. in the last several years, both in terms of likelihood and in terms of consequence. So these are, you know, these are acknowledged as problems affecting the world as a whole. And without dealing with these issues, it won't be possible for the world to achieve continued economic development in the way that we would want. Another bit of context is that there is a human right to water acknowledged by the international community and by the United Nations, which all countries have a duty to observe. And that means that the right that people have to access water needs to be observed, but at the same time, of course, there has to be sufficient resources to deliver on that right. Much of water policy, of course, is ultimately to do with how to ensure that the water is allocated and being used for the best social purposes that it is possible to do. Another bit of context is the cost of achieving the goals of the Sustainable Development Goals in water. The sort of number that is usually talked about is about $2 trillion in capital investment until 2030. That is a big number, but it is not an impossible number. It is not a number that is out of bounds of what is possible for the world to fund. The issue is how to mobilize those resources and ensure that they are well spent. Just a couple of other bits of context for you. And there is fantastic information available from UN publications, of which this is just a sample, of the issues of water stress and water scarcity essentially being a function of supply or demand exceeding supply, and where that is concentrated. And you'll see the heavy concentration through Southern Asia and Northern Africa in particular, of water-stressed domains affecting billions of our fellow people. And I'll just show you one more slide, again of context, which is that on the demand side of the equation, the projections are just for progressively increasing demand as populations grow and as economic activity increasingly is drawing on water resources. So these are the pressures that exist, pressures of human rights, pressures of demand exceeding supply, which are the subject essentially of why the Sustainable Development Goals were agreed in the first place. So these Sustainable Development Goals were put in place in 2015, agreed by the United Nations, by all member states of the United Nations. It is worth opening this document when you have a spare moment and reading the actual decision on the Sustainable Development Goals. It's a major piece of international work that, as I said, achieved universal acceptance. And no country has walked away from these since they were adopted. They are the follow-up of the 1990s reforms through the Rio process. They are the next stage of international attempts to address poverty and economic development in the world. There are key features of them, and I just want to identify 4 key features because they're very important for what we're about to talk about. The first is the ambition of the reforms. I won't read this, but you have a quick scan of it. This is rhetoric. This is language from the actual United Nations resolution agreed by all governments. It's an extremely ambitious objective here. The world is trying to make itself a better place for all people. And all governments of all political persuasions and all levels of development were willing to adopt this language. So the first thing to remember about these goals is just their sheer level of ambition. The second thing is their comprehensiveness. Yes, there is a goal on water and sanitation, but there are many other goals which are also fundamental to poverty reduction and economic development. And the objective of the Sustainable Development Goals and Agenda 2030 was that there would be a comprehensive work plan that all countries could get behind. The third feature I want to highlight is the universality of this objective, but more than that, this language about no one being left behind. And there's some very important messaging here in this language, which you must reflect on, we all must reflect on, particularly the last sentence that I've quoted here. Now, this is a central policy challenge, which all governments face. How do you prioritize your work? How do you, where do you start? No government can do everything all at once. And the decision here, as adopted again by all governments, is that we will leave no one behind and will endeavour to reach the furthest behind first. Now that may not accord with what we see in actual policy in many countries, but it is the agreed political objective. And finally, another key feature of these reforms is accountability, and that is being clear about who is responsible for what. There is nowhere to hide with these goals. National governments have the responsibility for ensuring they are achieved. There is a review process which the United Nations manages through an entity called the HighLevel Political Forum, where all governments have to be transparent about their progress, and UN specialist agencies report publicly on the progress of all countries in achieving these goals. So it's not a matter of being a legal type of accountability where governments that fail to achieve them will all end up in some kind of international court or something like that. But it is the court of public opinion and of public visibility that all governments are subject to. And there are strong provisions in the Agenda 2030 about the visibility and transparency of what is happening to achieve these goals. And that then empowers all sectors of society to involve themselves through the availability of that information. I just make the final point that the clock is ticking real fast here, where there's fewer than 4,500 days to go. And that's not many days, but I'll come back to that. The real point I was just making there is that another feature of these goals is that there is a deadline that they're to be achieved by 2030, except that in the case of the environment target in the water goal, that is to be achieved by 2020, which is, as we all know, just around the corner. So when it comes to water, there is a specific goal related to water and sanitation. It has its headline is to ensure the availability and sustainable management of water and sanitation for all. Returning to my key themes on the Agenda 2030 as a whole, in my opinion, the key words in these are the "for all" words. The last two words are very important words, not to be forgotten or overlooked in which in an attempt to achieve the ensure word and the sustainability word, it is easy to overlook the for all words, but they are terribly important words. There are 8 key targets embodied in the Goal 6 and 11 indicators associated with those targets. Importantly, other Sustainable Development Goals also have water-related targets and indicators. It's just that Goal 6 is specifically focused on water and sanitation. So there are also water-related targets in all these other goals, which are also just as binding and important for governments. Just as given I think a half of the participants here are Australian, I just want you to be aware of Australia's national position on the Sustainable Development Goals. This is from the Foreign Policy White Paper, which was issued, and you can read that yourself. But the government is fully supportive of these goals and has said so publicly, and is backing that up by doing things that are not mandatory, but for example, the submission of a voluntary national report to this year's high-level political forum on our efforts to implement Sustainable Development Goal 6, and also our former Prime Minister's willingness to serve on the high-level panel on water, which I'll come to in just a minute. So we've talked about the importance of Agenda 2030. We've talked about the water goals in Agenda 2030. A couple of years ago, the former UN Secretary General and the World Bank President were thinking about what their institutions could do to support the implementation of these goals. And they were particularly concerned about the water goal because there is no sort of UN organization like the World Health Organization or the UNEP with environment that is focused just on water and can drive the political agenda in water. And there are a lot of reasons for that, which we won't get into today. That's another webinar. But absent such a institutional capacity inside this system, what could be done? So what they thought was, because water is so central, and because the water issues are issues that can only really be addressed with a high level of political will, what they would do was ask a group of sitting heads of state and heads of government to form a group that would advocate for the importance of the achieving of SDG 6 goals and try to motivate action among other heads of government through their capacities to meet and talk in a whole range of fora, and because of their leadership credentials as serving senior heads of government. The panel was just set up for 2 years. It was to do a particular job, and it was a bit of an experiment to see how whether this would help. So members of the panel were from a range of different countries, and Australia was proud to be a part of that process. And the countries you'll see are sort of none of the really big countries. Countries broadly representing the different geographic and cultural and regional parts of the world, and where water was a significant issue. Now, the high-level panel on water reported in March. It issued a report, which is this one here, called "Making Every Drop Count." It's quite a short report, very easy to read. I would ask you to have a look at it, and it endeavours to make what are really quite straightforward recommendations to the leadership of the world on what needs to be done to move things along. They also issued an open letter which hasn't had a real lot of traction, but nevertheless it's out there, and it includes this ringing call to everybody to get involved. And finally, they also issued a video. They've issued a couple of videos over the life of the panel, but the most recent one is there on this URL, and I hope some of you had a chance to look at that before the webinar, as you were prompted to do by the organisers, because that gives you a sense of the advocacy role that was exercised by the panel. Now, why is this not? Aha. Finally, just wrapping up on about the SDGs themselves. Australia, as a member of the panel, led a range of initiatives which were seen as quite foundational in ensuring that countries could make a start in improving their water management. We have initiated a reform called the World Water Data Initiative, and the purpose of that is essentially to reduce the costs and complexity to developing countries of accessing and using water data. Very hard to make evidence-based decisions about water if you don't have information to work with. A guidance material on managing water data has been published under the auspices of the HighLevel panel and put together by Australia, and that is all out there and publicly available. All of this is on the website that was on the previous slide, and all you do to find it is Google HLPW. It's all you got to do, and all this will come up. There's also a range of other materials, such as guidance on managing water for the environment, guidance on irrigation modernisation, which is still in preparation, guidance on the policy settings for addressing scarcity through a document called Water Guide, a new international standard on the labelling of water efficiency appliances, and so on. So these are the kinds of things Australia has been doing. Just to give you an example of how we've tried to breathe life into the challenge in front of us.
I know you're not finished, Tony.
This is a good time to pause, though, Trevor.
Right?
Give me a chance for a sip of water.
Yep, no, that's great. You are going to get a huge amount of. We aren't going to be able to deal with the questions that are coming on the board right now through this webinar, but you can see, just listening and watching the slides, and you've been deep into this for a long time, and there's a lot of people here who've got a lot of questions for you, and we're really I'm just saying how much you bring to this discussion, a vast amount of years involved in it. So thanks very much. I don't know quite where to start here. Maybe we'll just start here in Canada. Tahira in City of Brandon saying, what's the position of Canada in the SDGs, and is there any particular goal or goals that are mandatory for Canadian cities to achieve? That's pretty specific. There's a bit more open.
Yeah, but it's a question that I think raises broader questions about how it all works. So it's a useful question. Look, Canada has signed on to the Sustainable Development Goals, as have all United Nations member countries. So is just as committed to them as everyone else. Canada has an active aid program, which the Australian aid program, the things are done cooperatively on that front. There are no sort of mandatory requirements that apply at the city level or at the government level, at the national level for that matter. This is not a black letter law type process. It's about policy encouragement and policy direction. Canada, and I have not looked at Canada's national reporting on how it's going, but to answer your question, you really need to go into your own government's reporting on how it thinks Canada is tracking on SDG 6, and that will reveal where there may be some issues. For example, in many developed countries, including Australia and Canada, there are still real issues in remote communities, for example, in ensuring adequate water supply and safe water in those communities. And it wouldn't surprise me if Canada was facing similar challenges as countries like Australia and the US in ensuring adequate and safe water for those remote communities.
Yeah, it's amazing, to hear, as you said at the beginning, that water is one of the top 5 critical issues facing global issues now facing everyone, and that people and the level of discussion here is showing once again people are highly committed to it. Challenge of increasing population, climate change, significant stress on water resources. So with that in mind, Emily Thomas in Melbourne, City West Water, has got a couple of comments here. I understand the SDGs are global goals. However, as the targets and indicators are written from a global perspective, they're often unrelated to the Australian context, for example. Because of this, I'm struggling to come up with tangible actions that my business can undertake. It's very similar to what Tahira was saying a moment ago. As there's no uniform way of tracking or measuring against each goal, it's proving challenging. So my question then would be, how might the water utility, the water authority, look to create tangible actions and measure against the goals?
Well, thank you very much for that. That's another important question. I'd encourage you to have a look at the WASA's policy on the implementation of SDG 6, which is the association of all the Australian water utilities. So they have had a good hard look at just what they can do to promote and implement SDG 6 as commercially functioning water utilities, both in Australia and what they can do to help the broader global effort. And they have set down a range of practical ideas of how WASA members can contribute. But we might come back to that question a bit later in the in the talk.
A big, broad, open question from Professor Shu Qing. Yep, we agree that we should care about SDGs, but what's the channel for our voice? How can we influence decision makers? So, quite an open-ended question.
It is indeed, and it's again something that I want to come back to. But everybody can do something, and if you're an academic, there's a lot you can do to depending on your particular field, to fully ensure that there's a good understanding of just what in practical terms will make the most difference, to understand different perspectives and ways of addressing issues, and to share that information through peer-reviewed journal articles to generate, many important objectives in the world are supported by the academic community through their work, and this is one of them. But I can come back to that later.
No, that's all right. Look, the board's lit up with a whole lot of questions, but I think at this point we should just press on with the presentation, Tony. Not the least of which because there's a few interesting graphs, and every week we have a graph of the week here at ICEWARM, and I'm looking forward to seeing these next few graphs come up. Okay. And I really appreciate you show the books as you're presenting. It makes it clearer what we're doing.
Well,
so, all right,
that was a bit of a spoiler alert, wasn't it?
Nice thing.
Okay. So, what needs to be done? That's the second part of this presentation. The thing is, and this is not many words on this slide, but they're very important words, and that is the world is not on track. If we keep going the way we are, many countries are not going to achieve SDG 6 goals. So that is important to understand. So this is one of the graphs I think Trevor would have been talking about. It's prepared by the World Water Assessment panel as part of UNESCO. Excellent work they do, tracking progress. And what this graph is saying is that if things keep going the way they are, then of the countries they've looked at, which are which is only a subset of countries that are within this frame, only 15 are on track, and 68 could be brought on track by accelerating what they're doing, and 10 are going backwards. And this is in terms of the availability of what's called a basic drinking water service. So overall, in the previous 15 years, there was an 8% improvement from 81 to 89%. But as is the natural tendency, it gets harder and harder the closer you get to the final outcome. And so business as usual is not going to do it in many countries for achieving a universal basic drinking water services. That's one slide, an important message. There's a similar story with basic sanitation services. This is very sobering information, that there are 20 countries that have been surveyed here where they're actually going backwards, not forwards. Conditions are getting worse for the average citizen. And in fact, there are more countries in that category than countries that are on track to achieving universal access of improved sanitation service, or what's called basic sanitation service, by 2030. And the great majority of countries are making headway, but they're not making headway fast enough. So we all have to think about, including the academics in our group, and this comes to Professor Shi Qing's question. We have to think about, well, in the light of this sort of reality, what do we have to do? Now, I think the simple answer to the complex question is that many countries need to change their policy settings and do so quite substantially. Changing policy settings in water is always very difficult, as we know well in Australia, when we've been on a policy reform journey for a long time, and it's never easy. It's never easy because it's always entails a conflict between people that are feeling they're being disadvantaged compared to other people, and sectors of society that have particular interests and have particular accustomed ways of life. These are always politically difficult issues. And therefore policy change, maintaining policy stability is the easy thing to do, but it won't achieve for many countries. It will mean a big fail for SDG 6. Policy change is the hard thing to do. And those of us who work in government need and are working in government in countries that face this problem need to be thinking about what has to change, not how to hold the status quo together. The high-level panel on water report got right into this question. Because they were serving heads of government, they had political experience, they understood how hard it would be to do this. So their report, and I would ask you please to read it. First of all, it talks about how important it is to raise the profile at the political level of how important water and sanitation are to national development. Politicians need to be talking about it to the people and engaging people in discussion. One of the ways this was channeled through the panel is this concept of how water is valued by society. So that the panel report has a section on valuing water. This isn't just valuing water in terms of what price to put on a bit of water, but what benefits does society want to achieve from its water resources? How do those benefits, how can those benefits be reconciled if there isn't enough water to achieve them all, which is usually the case? What trade-offs need to be considered? How does a society make the trade-offs that are required? You know, so in Australia, for example, over the last 10 years, we've had a major debate about how much, you know, what kind of environmental condition do we want to have in the Murray-Darling Basin system, and what sort of economic condition do we want to have, and how to get the right outcome that works for the society as a whole in that contest of objectives. And many developing countries will have much more complex issues than that to work through, but they must be worked through through political engagement and by raising the profile, as I said, of the importance of these issues. The funding challenge, $2 trillion seems like an awful lot of money to raise in 12 years. But just even a small country like Australia, I should say, has over $2 trillion sitting in the bank in superannuation and pension fund savings. It's just sitting there looking for, what that money is looking for is a good, safe place to have a modest long-term return. What could be more suited than the water sector? But the water sector will only be attractive for such investments if the risks can be reduced. Reducing risk in water is a really hard thing. It requires a lot of policy sophistication. It usually involves removing what are presently government discretions and ministerial discretions to do things with water, and having a more systematized approach with legal protections and so forth. Things that will be unpopular, things that many people, and including ministers, will resist. But if you want to mobilize these amazing savings that the rich world has accumulated over the last 100 years to do good things in the water sector, then countries that are not on track to achieve SDG 6 will need to think about how to try to take the risk out of those investments. So the high-level panel report talks a lot about the financing challenge and raises this issue. Thirdly, there's an issue of how to manage expectations and how to deal with how to form partnerships and comity of interest, what we call comity of interest in some quarters. That is where there's a mutuality of interest in everybody working together. That is a social challenge which goes well beyond government power to determine. It's a matter of how society operates, how much people are willing to work with other sectors of the society and across normal boundaries in the society. As I said before, the status quo isn't, business as usual is not going to do it. So all these things that require fundamental changes in the way we operate have to be thought about. Because most countries in the world, Australia is a happy exception to this rule, have international borders that where water resources are shared, then those water resources can only be effectively managed if there are effective relations with the neighbours in the management of those resources. There are many water agreements in the world, about 400 of them, which is a great thing, but there are hundreds and hundreds of shared basin catchments and shared catchments and basins that cross national boundaries where there are no agreements in place as well. such agreements have to be negotiated, and they have to be negotiated with a objective of all peoples benefiting in the long run for having agreed approaches in place. So these and many other suggestions and recommendations are embodied in the high-level panel report. Now, Trevor, did you want to pause there for further questions, or will we move on?
No, I think we should take some questions. The board is there's a lot of questions here.
Because this what needs to be done section is pretty fundamental.
Okay.
But we don't want to run out of time to talk about what people can do.
No, that's very fair. Thank you for taking the break. And look, as you see these questions, maybe Tony, if you could just pull up your Q&A screen, you might be able to just make a bit of a decision about which ones we should take on first. But rather than start from the top and just work our way down, maybe we should just pick the ones that well, here's one from Vamshi in Hyderabad, Vamshi Raj. Just a simple one. Where is India on the path of the SDG?
Look, I can't. No. India is a huge country, which is making fantastic progress in some areas, as I understand it, but is struggling in some other areas. Mm-hmm. So I think I can't answer that question generally.
And a similar question from Rita, you might see just a bit further down below Vamshi's question was, how does Australia's contribution compare in global SDGs relative to other developed countries?
Look, if the question is about our aid program, then we do have a significant aid program in water. But achieving these goals is not primarily about what aid can do.
I think Rita is aiming at SDG 6 in that question.
Yeah. So if the question is about how we can help other countries, and how we compare with others in helping other countries, well, most developed countries with aid programs have a significant water activity, including Australia. But my point is that the solution isn't going to lie in the aid program. The aid program can help, but the solution has to ultimately depend on national policy settings. Can I just go to the first question that I came to from the anonymous attendee about reality being driven by economics? Well, I think that is partly true, but reality is also driven by politics.
Unfortunately.
And, they can be intersecting circles. And so long as you can, as policy advisors, find solutions which are in the long-term economic interests of the nation, as most water improvements will be, and are possible for politicians to implement, then the fact that they may be driven by economics is really not the key point.
Right.
Economics can also make lots of things possible that are otherwise not possible.
Yep. All right. Well, let's keep moving. We'll probably have to keep the shorter answers rather than longer at this point, because of the sheer number of questions. Where should we go next?
So there's a question from Mr. Sadiq.
Yep.
About transboundary collaboration.
Do you think SDG 6.5?
Yes, the short answer is yes.
Maybe I'll read it out so everybody can have a hear of the question. It says, do you think SDG 6.5 can be an entry point to bring in countries for transboundary collaboration on waters, especially to countries who did not ratify the UN Water Conventions? If yes, how? If not, why?
Well, 6.5, as I was just saying before, can't be fully implemented without agreement on transboundary waters. Countries are always free to talk to their neighbours about those agreements, and many attempts are always being made to do that, regardless of whether they've ratified the UN Water Conventions, which provides some guidance on how to enter into such agreements. But the whether or not you're a party to the UN Water Convention doesn't affect your freedom as a sovereign state to enter into negotiations with your neighbour over the sensible use of shared water resources.
Yeah, that makes sense. No, that's good. Yeah, Susie Goldsmith says, please could you amplify or comment on the comprehensive work plan? How far has this got, and what will advance it?
Susie, nice that you've joined us.
Thanks.
I think you mean, but my comment on Agenda 2030 as a whole, if that's what you mean, then the High-Level Political Forum is the custodian of that work plan, and you'll see there is a fantastic information being maintained. So if you like, the goals and indicators of all 17 Sustainable Development Goals constitute the comprehensive work plan.
Right.
What the High-Level Political Forum does is keep stock on how everybody is travelling on that work plan. So there's a helicopter view of how it's all going, and the strong points and the weak points are exposed through that process. But that is all on the UN websites.
Yep. You're obviously going to get a fair bit of, if you are willing, interest from people after this webinar, Tony. So we may have that discussion before we finish, as whether we hand some of these questions to you, and there'll be more than just these two. But thanks a lot for this. Thonglith in Laos says, I'm not sure whether Laos has signed up to achieve the SDG, but he goes on to say, my understanding is SDG goals set in each country may be different in the practical level. For example, water sources may not be accessed, and not because of water scarcity, but because of water quality, and not consumable during flood and natural disasters.
Yes, that's correct. Every country's situation is different. Laos, along with every other country, has signed up to the SDGs, but each country is able to figure out for itself how to achieve them, and that will depend on the particular circumstances in each country. So the third question that I asked at the beginning of the slide was, why should you care about this? Well, as I saw the survey, you are all working in a professional domain. You have chosen a working life where you're committed to your particular subject area, which is a fantastic thing, and good on you. In choosing that vocation, I expect you are all in your own way wanting to make a contribution to improving the world we live in. And so that's one reason you should care. The second is that, in my experience, you could, whatever your job is, whatever particular responsibilities and duties you have, you'll be able to do that job better if you have a good understanding of how it fits in to what is going on globally. It'll improve your perspective, your judgment, and your capacity to advise and implement your own duties if you have that good understanding. And thirdly, you're working in an agency or a university or wherever you are working, there are substantial opportunities due to the level of investment that's going to be needed in solving the water challenge. There are opportunities proliferating in being able to contribute to that. There are all sorts of projects going on, and there are companies and governments that are, and international organisations working actively on new solutions to help national governments to achieve the SDG 6 goals. Whether they're innovative policy solutions or innovative infrastructural solutions or technical approaches to efficiency or whatever they happen to be, you have a considerable opportunity to augment the work of your agency as a whole. So there are three reasons that I think are all reasons that you should care about what we're talking about today. In terms of what...
About 3 or 4 minutes to go.
Yeah, in terms of what, why now? Well, let's not dwell on this. I told you how many days there are to go. If there are 2 billion people still without access to secure water, that means about 500,000 people a day have to get access between now and 2030, or we're going to fall behind. So just put that in perspective. Or putting it another way, every day that we are falling behind, those people are suffering who shouldn't need to suffer. So now the curve is not sloping in the right direction. The sooner we can get it in the right direction, the better. So what can you do? Now I'll just leave you with 3 ideas, all hanging off the high-level panel on water's call. Whoever you are, whatever you do, wherever you live, we all have a responsibility. The first is you can improve your own understanding. You can try to get on top of these issues. There is masses of public information and lots of non-public information which you can access to help you improve your own knowledge. As a professional person, that's one thing you can do. Second, you can become an advocate for the importance of these issues in any forum that you can access, including just in your own work team and your work group. Talk about it with people. Talk about the fundamental importance of these SDGs. And I've given you some slides today that you're welcome to draw on in talking about that. Advocacy can take all sorts of forms. Just do whatever you can do, and don't self-censor your self. And if you're working in a government, you can exercise that advocacy internally by talking to your seniors and your ministers about the importance of these things. Thirdly, get involved. There are lots of ways as a water professional you can engage. And I've just mentioned 2 organisations that I'm a member of, and you might also want to become a member of if you're not already, which as an individual, you're free to join at a relatively low cost. And through these organisations, you'll be exposed to these issues as they unfold, and there are lots of discussion groups and things going on, and technical groups and so forth through the IWA and the IWRA and other organisations too, which you can join. So I would encourage you to get involved, to advocate and to understand.
Well, thank you everyone for participating. That's really good. You can see the 6, 7, 8 webinars coming up over the next couple of, all free webinars coming over the next couple of months. Do please join us. We'd love you to do that. And there's some online courses there. Just go on to the website icewarm.com.au and you'll see opportunities available there, or follow us on Twitter at ice_warm_. It's on your screen there now. But thank you everybody for joining us today. We've enjoyed this immensely, and particularly thank you to Tony. For now, it's goodbye.
Subscribe to this YouTube channel by clicking the subscription button below. For future webinars and online short courses, please visit our website at australianwaterschool.com.au.